Hey y'all, so this is our first day of online notes. What we're going to be talking about today is the Reactionary 20s. Now, the Reactionary 20s is also happening during the time of the Roaring 20s. And we talked about the Roaring 20s, all these new, exciting, sort of scandalous things that are happening in the 1920s. But then we also have this reaction to it, which is people not wanting to have these new things. They're wanting to stick to traditional values, traditional ways of doing things. And that's a little bit of what we're going to be talking about today. Now, one of the events that happens in the 20s that we can see this sort of reaction to new ways of doing things is that we are going to have what's called the Scopes trial. Now, the Scopes trial is a trial that takes place in Dayton, Tennessee, in which a young teacher had taught the theory of evolution in their class. Now, by doing this, they're violating a Tennessee law saying that you could only teach creationism or the biblical teaching of creation of mankind by God. So by teaching evolution, he violated this Tennessee law. Now, when this case goes to trial, we see Scopes is going to be the defendant, and the prosecutor is William Jennings Bryan, which he was our 1896 Populist Party candidate for president, if you remember that from way back then when we talked about the Populist Party. But this trial in particular is going to have a lot of media surrounding it. It's going to get a lot of media attention, so it's going to get the nickname of the Scopes Monkey Trial because of that. Ultimately, Scopes is found guilty and fined $100, and evolution is banned from being taught in most public schools until the 1960s. Now, because of the media presence surrounding this trial, we'll see in the small town of Dayton, Tennessee, there will be lots of books and things and cameras showing the streets of sort of what it was like in Dayton during the trial. And you could see there the Anti-Evolution League was in Dayton, sort of promoting this idea against teaching evolution in schools. And then the monkey you can see there was dressed up and toted around as William Jennings Bryan, kind of talking about his side of the case and drawing media attention to the case itself. Now, another thing that happens in the 20s is the Temperance Movement, which we already know. The 18th Amendment abolished the sale, consumption, and production of alcohol in the 1920s. This anti-alcohol movement, the Temperance Movement, really grew in popularity in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Groups like the Anti-Saloon League are supporting this idea of temperance. Y'all got to see a little bit about Carrie Nation, who was a temperance leader during this time, who would actually go to saloons and destroy all the alcohol in the saloon with a hatchet. So this was another movement sort of pushing against these new ways of doing things and wanting to stick to traditional values during the 20s. We also have during the 20s a fear of communism that's growing in the country. This is going to stem from the communist revolution or the Bolshevik revolution that started in Russia in the middle of World War I, which is why Russia got out of World War I. Now, because of this, the U.S. is going to have this real fear of communism that's happening during this time, which is called the Red Scare. Now, also during World War I, there's going to be a lot of different laws like the Espionage Act and Sedition Act limiting people's abilities to speak out against the government during times of war. But even after the war is over, the government's going to start doing something called the Palmer Raids. And the Palmer Raids were actually the U.S. government would go into people's homes that were suspected communists, and they would raid their home, basically looking for evidence of them being communists. They wouldn't have search warrants. They wouldn't have any legal grounds to do this, but nevertheless, they're going into people's homes, searching for evidence of them being a communist. Now, we'll see that this Red Scare will come back around when we get to the Cold War, which happens after World War II. Now, also during this time, we have this fear of anarchism happening in the country, which anarchism is this idea of self-government, so not having big government institutions, but rather the people are kind of just making decisions for themselves. We don't have established government in any sort of way, which kind of goes hand in hand with this idea of communism, which communism itself is the idea that all property is commonly held by the community. So it's not necessarily individual ownership of things, and things are shared within the community as a whole. So anarchism and communism kind of can go hand in hand, but communism usually has some more structure associated with it, which oftentimes that structure does come in the form of a government.